Okay, so we're looking at nutrition for special populations today. It is our final day of PFT 107. So you're kind of last PowerPoint here. And so first we need to kind of define like what we mean when we say special populations, right? Obviously that's referring to anybody outside of like your normal average everyday adult. So like individuals who might have diabetes or heart disease, people who are, seniors, youngsters, all different populations that we're looking at. So we'll talk a little bit about like what are the conditions, special considerations for dietary needs for diabetics, prenatal clients, teen athletes, college athletes, master athletes, which is a very politically correct way of saying seniors, and vegetarians. So understanding, like, this is another one of those days that's like we're gonna have like some very segmented notes, but when we're understanding like a special population, right, and we come up with like a meal plan or a diet, right, we want it to be able to meet like their basic metabolic needs first, and then we can meet any of like the unique energetic demands of like whatever their sport is or their population or whatever. And so when it comes to like meal plans for special populations, we'll focus on primarily first basic metabolic needs, and obviously any unique metabolic how many unique meatballs somebody needs, metabolic demands for a sport population, etc. So we will be looking at kind of like first, obviously, I mean, like, this does not mean that any of your normal nutrition stuff disappears, right? It's oftentimes like you're not removing any of the needs for normal nutrients. What you're doing is you're just simply adding a little bit, right? You're adding something for that special population. So there are going to be nutritional considerations that need to be made here. So first one we're going to go ahead and look at is diabetes, right? So diabetes. Whenever I say it's slow like that, I always think of this old sketch that Jimmy Kimmel did, where he was actually making fun of Karl Malone. And he was like, Karl Malone thinks they should change the name of diabetes to libabetes, because everybody gets all depressed and they go, oh no, I'm gonna diabetes. And I'm sorry, I was thinking that whenever I say that word. So what is diabetes? It is going to be a metabolic disorder that affects carbohydrate availability and utilization. Okay, so it's going to be characterized by impaired blood glucose control. Okay, so this somebody who has diabetes is going to have either the inability for their cells to be able to uptake glucose, and there's going to be two reasons for that. It's either going to be due to type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, right? So type 1 diabetes is going to be the pancreas fails to create enough insulin. So basically, if a person's like a type 1 diabetic, their pancreas just isn't working the way it's supposed to. And so it should be making insulin, which is a hormone that triggers pulling sugar out of your blood and having it enter your cells. But unfortunately, in type 1 diabetics, that doesn't happen, right? And so a lot of times that can lead to things like hyperglycemia, which is pretty dangerous, actually. And then we also have type 2 diabetics, which is definitely the most common one. This is what we generally think of when we think of diabetes. But type 2 diabetics are where the body's cells have become resistant to insulin, okay? So when I say like the body's, and actually, hold on, I should put hyperglycemia up here. Hyperglycemia can happen in both type 1 and type 2 diabetics, but it's definitely going to be more common in type 1. It results in hyperglycemia, which is abnormally high blood glucose levels, right? And this can cause complications in the body's cells, right? A lot of times it can lead to things like neuropathy. So like the nerve cells actually suffocate, and so then they can't communicate anymore because there's too much sugar in there and it keeps oxygen from being able to bind the way it's supposed to. So hyperglycemia is very dangerous, right? And we've all experienced like minor bouts of hyperglycemia. Like if you've ever had just like a super sugary meal and you're like, I have so much energy. Like that's hyperglycemia. But when it's elevated like that for extended periods of time, that's when it becomes really dangerous here. So when we're looking at type 2 diabetes, right, what we are going to be looking at here is the body's become resistant to insulin, right? So you know what I'm going to do? I'm sorry. I'm just going to change this ever so slightly. I'm just going to remove that from there and put this down here like that, because I don't like where I'm headed with this. There we go. So hyperglycemia, abnormally blood glucose levels. We also sometimes see hypoglycemia, which is what happens when somebody takes too much insulin. That's abnormally low blood glucose levels. Those can be really dangerous as well because that can cause your client to pass out. It can even result in things like comas. But when we're talking about like glucose, right, we're talking about like, you know, how our body controls that is through these two main hormones, right? The first one is going to be insulin. So insulin is a hormone, whoa, that triggers the usage of glucose. I don't know, that's not how I want to say it. Hormone triggers the body's removal of glucose from the bloodstream to be uptaken by the body's cells. There we go. That's a much better definition, right? Is uptaken not a word? Oh, it's two words. Okay. So when we're looking at it, right, like insulin's job is to lower your blood sugar levels, right? But if your pancreas doesn't create enough of that, then you're going to need to take some synthetically, right? Or let's say your body has become resistant to it, you're still going to take some synthetically. And so that's where like you see diabetics taking glucose injections. By the way, 95% of diabetes cases are actually type 2, but it is a fairly preventable disease. It's something that really shouldn't happen. You know, it is when your body creates excessive levels of insulin, it slowly becomes resistant to that insulin. And when that happens, like it doesn't have the same effect that it used to. Now, the opposite of insulin is going to be another hormone called glucagon, which is also created by the pancreas. And this is a hormone that triggers the body's release of glucose from glycogen stores in order to raise blood sugar levels, right? So glucagon's job is to like get your levels back to normal, right? Like if your blood sugar drops too low, your body will trigger the release of glucagon, which will kind of raise it back to normal. But whenever that happens, it also often triggers like hunger and things like that because your body's like, well, my blood sugar is low, so it's very clear that we need some source of calories. Now, the thing about diabetes that is somewhat like dangerous here is that diabetes often results in a lot of what we call ketone bodies as a byproduct here. And what a ketone body is, it's a molecule that's formed when you have insufficient carbohydrates available for the metabolism, right? And so it'll actually complete its metabolism from fat. When you hear of somebody being on like a keto diet, what they are doing is they're going into a state of ketosis, which is basically a state where there is an excessive amount of ketone bodies. So when you don't have any carbohydrates, you know, carbohydrates are our main energy source, right? Like our body likes to take carbohydrates, convert them into glucose, and boom, there we go, we got ATP. But if your body can't do that, what it'll do instead is it'll create ketone bodies from fat molecules. And those ketone bodies will eventually get converted into acetyl-CoA. And that acetyl-CoA can then go through the Krebs cycle. So this is something that happens, but it can't happen in the process of glycolysis. that is why, like, a lot of times when you think of like somebody on a keto diet, they're on a super, super high fat, low carbohydrate diet because like they're trying to produce as many ketone bodies as possible. So ketosis is a condition that happens when you have a normally high ketone bodies running throughout your cells. Now that can be fine. Like, I'm not here to say that that is super unhealthy. However, ketone bodies have a lot of hydrogen ions on them, which is what makes them very, very acidic. And so you can end up with a condition when you do this called ketoacidosis, which is the acidification of your blood due to a buildup of ketone bodies. And what you need to do is you need to balance out. When that happens, you need to balance out your pH. You're incredibly acidic, so you need to become more alkaline. You need to be a little more base in response to that ketoacidosis. Well, how do you get more alkaline foods into your diet? Usually those are in the form of like dark leafy green vegetables and things like that, which are great, but unfortunately are also a source of carbohydrates. So if you're trying to avoid carbohydrates, that's how a lot of times, like, this is why a lot of people do tend to get in trouble on a keto diet. Plenty of people I know have had a ton of success on the keto diet. I'm not here to like tear it down or knock it. But I will say, like, if you do it improperly, it can be dangerous, just like any other diet, right? You could get your 45 to 65% of carbohydrates in a day, which is the healthy recommended range according to the USDA. But what if all of that 45 to 65% was white granulated sugar? Okay, yeah, like I got my 45 to 65%, but it's not exactly healthy, right? You can cause problems with any type of diet. So I'm not here to like really knock the keto diet. I will say there is not a lot of strong evidence to suggest that it is better than a normal diet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad for you. So if you're in that population where it works for you, that's fine, but it's not fair to say that it is better for everyone, which is often, I think, the message that we hear, and people like me are like, it's not a very fair way of going about it. Type 1 diabetes, right? Like I said, the pancreas stops producing insulin. Type 2 diabetes, the pancreas creates insulin, but your body cells don't really respond to it anymore. This is very common for obese individuals who are above the age of 35. We definitely know that like that abdominal obesity, like we talked about yesterday, excessive BMI, high body fat percentage, all of those are risk factors for diseases such as diabetes. And there's just something about like abdominal fat that tends to cause diabetes more often. And that's typically thought to be because when your fat is all clumped up like that, it kind of starts to act like its own organ in a really weird way and have its own metabolism and damages other parts of your metabolism. And it's very, very bad. There's also prediabetes, which I hate. I hate the fact that we have this term. I hate prediabetes and I hate prehypertension. But it's a condition in which your glucose levels are not elevated enough to be diabetes, but it's like, hey, you get really high blood sugar levels. That's prediabetes, which I don't know. If it's not really causing any problem, I don't think that it deserves its own term. That's a strong Brad opinion only. Don't worry about like knowing that. That's just me being a cynic. Those are kind of our different things that we're looking at there. Like those are our common hormones that are related to this disease, right? So symptoms of somebody who might be developing diabetes, oftentimes they'll experience like blurred vision. The cones in your eyes actually do not function as well. It's not that your cones aren't functioning, but the nervous system's response to those cones starts functioning improperly. Unexplained weight loss out of nowhere, that can be a sign of diabetes. Excessive hunger. If your wounds are healing really slowly, that's a big one. But the most common ones are going to be clients who experience a lot of thirst, excessive urination. So they're very thirsty, but they're still like peeing all the time, and dehydration. And so the reason for that is because like when your body is trying to get rid of all that sugar, it's just like, all right, well, let's get rid of it any way that we can. And so it tries to bring in lots of water to get you to pee, and then you can pee all that out. Regular exercise is awesome for diabetes. It has these really amazing effects because you are tapping into all of that. Like exercise is moderate to high intensity. And so that high intensity means that you're going to tap into glucose as a primary fuel source. And when you do that, it enhances how effectively your body uses insulin. Your body's like, I finally got a use for all this insulin stuff. And so then suddenly it starts actually using it again. And that increases the sensitivity to insulin. Because insulin is actually an anabolic hormone. Like, we like insulin. It's used for muscle building. It's used for the development of glycogen. And so if you can give your body a reason to develop glycogen and a reason to use that insulin towards building muscle, this is one of the reasons why like exercise is just so very good for diabetics. However, things to be aware of, type 1 diabetics do need to be a little extra cautious, because type 1 diabetics, it isn't so much that their body's cells have become resistant to insulin, their body is not making insulin the way it's supposed to. And so a lot of times they're going to need to inject insulin in the appropriate amounts at the proper times in order to make sure that their glucose levels are normal, and they should be monitoring those and making adjustments like if they need to. And you'll see pro athletes who have type 1 diabetes, and they'll basically just be monitoring it. They kind of get a handle on it. They work with like a dietitian on the team or whatever. And they get used to kind of being able to manage it. It's a very manageable disease. So when it comes down to it, our recommendations, if your client's like glucose level is like less than 100 milligrams of glucose per deciliter of blood, we're going to want to get some carbohydrates in pre-exercise, maybe somewhere between 15 and 40 grams. If it is greater than 250 milligrams per deciliter, that means that our sugar levels are exceptionally high. So we're going to want to do like a urine test for ketone bodies to make sure that our client is not is in such a hyperglycemic state. If that is the case and there are ketones there, we don't want to exercise because what will happen is like they're already becoming, all those ketone bodies are making them incredibly acidic, and exercise is going to create things like lactic acid, which is going to make them more acidic, and that can cause metabolic damage. So we don't want to do that. If there isn't a lot of ketones present, then okay, you can exercise. And then if it's even higher than that, but still like no ketones present, it's like, okay, well, you can exercise, but be cautious. You guys probably aren't going to necessarily see these numbers very often, but every now and then it's a good idea to understand we want to be somewhere between 100 and 250 milliliters of glucose levels before exercise. That's honestly like the simplest recommendation. So if you have like a diabetic client, for the most part, guys, like they deal with this every day. I mean, you're dealing it with your 1 hour session, but they're constantly dealing with this condition, so they know how to manage their blood sugar levels. But I definitely recommend with like new clients, like I've always said this to my diabetic clients, like, hey, keep an eye on your blood sugar levels before you come in. And then like I always tell them like, hey, if you go to like a birthday party or something the night before, and you're out partying or you're out doing something, maybe you had like a night of drinking or something, just be aware it's going to mess with your blood sugar levels. So like, if you have slipped into comfort with our training sessions and like you don't test your blood sugar necessarily every time before you come in, anytime you do something like that, please test your blood sugar levels for me, just so that you can be aware, like I want you somewhere between 100 and 250. And those are the numbers that they're used to as well. So maintain when it comes to managing diabetes, you want to maintain a fasting glucose level in order to prevent that hyper or hypoglycemia, right? Both of those are going to be really bad. Hyperglycemia can be really dangerous because, like I said, it can straight up cause like necrosis of tissues, right? This is where you end up with like, I'm not going to pull up a picture of it. But if you've ever seen like diabetic ulcers, they can be a little rough to look at. And it's literally where like tissue dies. Usually it's in the extremities, like low blood flow areas, like the fingertips and toes, commonly the toes. And so like you start to develop like these vascular issues. So our recommendations, diet should be based on individual food choices, cultural food choices. All that can be totally normal with a diabetic client. It doesn't have to be crazy special. Carbohydrate recommendations, definitely something really important here. We're still going to see a normal 45 to 65% energy intake. However, our adjustments that we're going to make Some adjustments, we do not want sugary foods to replace nutrient-dense carbohydrates. The focus of carbohydrate intake should always be on nutrient-dense foods rather than foods that are high in sugar. So we want to avoid sugars with our clients, because here, like, let's take a look at like what our blood glucose levels look like, right? I'm hoping, yeah, I'm not looking for something like that. There we go. So take a look right here. Let's just say this is like, you know, somebody's glucose levels, right? We can see the glucose is the red line right here. So as your red line spikes, guess what? Your insulin spikes as well in response. And then like as that goes down, your insulin turns down as well. And so like you can see it's like, okay, great. Like insulin is keeping up with all the glucose as it comes in. However, let's say like you just spike your blood, the more intensely that you spike your blood sugar, this little gap right here, that gap indicates the fact that your body created like kind of more insulin than it really needed to, right? So then like you raise your blood sugar levels again, and it's like your insulin levels came up to kind of respond to that, but like maybe they were a little slow to respond. And so we see a little gap here, then eventually they kind of get back in sync again. And so like, this is kind of what we're looking at here. What we want to make sure we don't do is end up outside of normal ranges, because when that happens, your body goes, whoa, I need to produce a bunch of insulin. And so it kind of in the same way that like we tend to overcorrect, you know, when we do something. Have you ever been like late for work and you just speed like crazy on the way to work, and then you end up like 5 minutes earlier than you normally do? It's like, man, I really endangered some people on my way here today. You know, like that's kind of what happens with insulin. Your body like overcompensates and creates more of it than it needs to. What ends up happening is that drives all of the sugar out of your blood, and now suddenly you're hypoglycemic, where your blood sugar levels are too low. And so your body's going to create some glucagon to get them back to normal, but it's also going to create some things like ghrelin hormones to get you to go consume some food. Then you go consume some food, and because you were so hungry, you ended up consuming a lot of food, and boom, you spiked your blood sugar levels again. And that's how this is such a vicious cycle. So we definitely don't want to focus on sugary foods. We want to focus on foods that are high in fiber, right? Now, protein intake, you actually do need to be a little cautious about with diabetics, for two reasons. Number one, protein can be converted into sugar so that they can raise their glucose levels again. But number two, one of the other dangers of elevated elevated protein intake is that your kidneys are primarily in charge of like processing that, and elevated glucose levels can affect kidney function. So then you're making them work doubly hard, and so it can cause kidney dysfunction there. And that's definitely something we need to be cautious of. So protein intake should range 15 to 20%. And fat intake should be less than 30% total energy intake. Sorry, dogs are going crazy. Stop it. So those are all the things that we're going to look at there. Signs of hypoglycemia, which are also signs oftentimes of hyperglycemia, actually. Kind of goes in both directions. Sweating is a sign of hypoglycemia, or a pounding heart, hunger. Shakiness, that's a classic one. Like when somebody's like shaking, I actually get like that sometimes whenever I like if I don't get enough like carbs before like a really intense workout, I'll sometimes go hypoglycemic and get all frustrated. Incoordination, lethargy, headache, nausea, all those things. Nausea is a big one. Nausea is something that happens to like a lot of people. You know, you don't have to be diabetic to end up with low blood sugar levels. If you just, I mean, I'm sure everybody in here has been like, I'm gonna go do my workout, and then you didn't have time to eat, and you're like, I guess I'll have like a hard-boiled egg because that's the one thing I got in the fridge because I forgot to go grocery shop, you know. And all of a sudden you show up in the gym, you work really hard, and you feel like you're gonna throw up. You know, that's a sign of like low blood sugar levels, which is why like eating a banana is actually a great way to kind of make you feel better pretty quickly. And then on the other side of things, we're going to see muscle cramps, nausea, again, associated with hyperglycemia, nervousness or shakiness, and then sometimes like abdominal pain, actually, because they're experiencing abdominal cramping. So those are some of our general recommendations for diabetes. Let's go ahead and take a look if we're looking at like pregnant athletes, right? So looking at pregnant athletes, right? So these are individuals who choose to stay active, but will follow a logical decrease in activity. So obviously, like a pregnant athlete is not necessarily going to be doing, you know, split jerks and things like that, maybe the way they were before, but they are still going to like exercise and maintain activity. That's actually a really great part of it. It's healthy for the mother, it's healthy for the fetus. There's everything that it's good in a million different ways there. So we may want to stay active here, but we do want to have like necessary precautions, right? Follow up with like a physician actively. I mean, obviously that's going to happen naturally anyways. Make some routine changes if you need to, you know, reduce the intensity of exercise. We've talked about pregnancy in our special populations class, so I'm not going to spend all the time talking about our other adjustments we make, but basically don't lay your client down on their stomach, don't lay them down on their back, try to keep them in a relatively upright position, and then adjust like a lot of times they're going to overheat very, very easily, so make sure that you have water nearby, and like they tell them to dress in layers so that it's easy to kind of maintain like a normal temperature. That's more of a comfort thing, but still like absolutely huge to keep your client from, you know, firing you. So focusing on total normal calories, right? However, there are going to be a couple different things here. So focus on total calories, protein, folate is going to be a big one in particular, right? So nutritional strategies are focused on protein intake, I'm sorry, total calories, protein intake, vitamins in particular, A, B's, and C, as well as magnesium, iron, and plenty of fluids, right? Because again, your pregnant clients are often going to overheat very easily. Talk to any mother and they'll tell you like that is one of the most irritating things about pregnancy. So in general, in terms of like a recommendation for how many like calories, we're going to see an increase in about 300 calories per day. So typical caloric increase is around 300 calories per day. And so that's going to typically result in about a 25 to 35 pound weight gain during through the duration of pregnancy. So that should be a very logical thing to expect during pregnancy. So during that increase in consumption, right, we want to make sure that like that usually comes from the case of like increasing portion sizes slightly or adding 1 or 2 small snacks throughout the day. Both those are really good strategies for doing that, right? So protein is definitely going to be critical for like the development of like the baby's organs and tissues, as well as like tissues in like the mother. So we're also going to see an additional consume an additional 20 to 25 grams of protein per day. So those are some pretty standard recommendations there. That protein can come from things like skim milk, which is vitamin rich and nutrient rich, beef, chicken, or fish, beans, lentils, or other types of legumes. Beans are such an excellent source of protein, and then nuts as well. Like both of these are really good vegetarian options. I guess milk technically falls under vegetarian as well. Just not vegan options. And then beef, chicken, or fish are also really good there. So here's our recommendations here. You can see like, just so that you can kind of see like the differences here. I don't know how much this, let's see here. Actually, can I figure this out? I don't know how to do it. Let's say like 46 grams a day here for a non-pregnant client, right? We're going to see that increase by about 25 to 30 grams. So we're coming up to about 71 grams a day per year. Folate is usually about 400 grams a day recommended versus like 600. Vitamin C, right? So you can see all of these numbers are going to go up, particularly iron and magnesium are really important because like those are minerals that are very important for like the development of our body. You know, you're creating a lot of new like red blood cells. Like there's a new like body growing, right? And that body has blood just like we do. And so it's going to need, you know, hemoglobin, which means you're going to want to make sure that you have plenty of iron in your diet, but also magnesium because that helps in the utilization of that iron. Not to mention, just like really quickly, everybody's magnesium deficient. Like, good Lord, we need more magnesium in our diets. Everybody should be drinking chia seeds. Just all the time. Throw them into wherever you can get them. All right, so those are our pregnant athletes. I love how they say youngsters here. I think this is fun. So then we also see like youths, right? So kids. Youth athletes is what I'll put actually. All right, so primary focus here is to build like strong muscles and bones. Obviously, you know, if a youth is engaging in activity just like an adult, right? Like they're going to be tearing down the body, and so the body that's going to trigger growth within the body, which is a really good thing that we're looking for, right? Sports have also been shown to enhance self-esteem and confidence, which we've talked about plenty of times in our other special populations classes. Promotes general health and fitness. The most important thing, arguably, and this is actually something we're going to talk a lot about next module when we get to our youth program design class. But like the big reason we encourage like kids to exercise, I'm not trying to create like a little bodybuilder, you know, like I'm not trying to create like a little Olympic athlete. You know, if that kid's motivated by being the world's greatest soccer player, awesome. Like I'm in it and I'm going to help him. But like that's not really like our main goal. We're not trying to create the world's greatest youth athlete. What we're really trying to do is create like an adult who's going to have healthy habits built into their lifestyle. So they're going to be used to activity and they're going to continue those habits that they developed as a kid into adulthood. That is actually a great example of establishing lifelong patterns. One thing that we will talk a little bit about here is what's referred to as a growth channel, which is the normal height to weight growth pattern relationships. And this is where one of the other things this is another thing we're going to talk about in our youth class next module, not next class, but next module. And we'll look at like growth patterns and how our growth channels and how they're related to our client's body mass index, right? So with adults, the formula is weight in kilograms divided by height in meters square, and we say like 24.9 to 29.9 is considered overweight, right? Well, kids don't work that way, right? Kids are, you know, constantly going through like growth spurts and stuff. So rather than look, I mean, we still use the same formula. It's still height, it's still weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared, but instead, when we look at like a youth BMI, we actually look at what a percentile. So instead, what we look at is we want a youth to be somewhere between the 5th and 85th percentile. If you're in the 85th to 95th percentile, that is then what we consider to be overweight. And then 95th to 100 is what we consider to be obese. And then if they are below the 5th percentile in terms of weight, that is where they are going to be considered underweight. And so you can see it kind of fluctuates here, right? It's like a wave, which is very different from adults, which is just some very straight lines, right? A growth channel is the normal height to weight patterns. It's used to assess like the growth trends to look for any abnormalities, right? So this is honestly a very medical thing. This is not something that we're actually going to spend a lot of time doing. So it's used to assess the normal growth of a youth to look for any abnormalities, right? So if you have a kid who is not growing the way they should be, where maybe like they are like growing taller, but they're not growing heavier, that actually might be a sign that they are getting like insufficient nutrition. So when it comes to growing as youths, that actually occurs at some places, which is always fun to say, called your epiphyses, which are these epiphyseal plates. So epiphyseal, oh my God, can I do this? Plates, I spell it right? Probably not, never do. Which are these growth plates that you're actually going to notice in your skeletal system, right? And so here's like a bone that has yet to grow. The main section is called your diaphyses. This actually is not what grows. And you would think that like this kind of just stretches out when our bones get larger. But what's actually happening are these little lines right here, which these are epiphyseal plates. This is actually where growth occurs at the ends here. So your epiphyses are the ends of your bones, and that's actually where growth occurs, and you can kind of see some of those epiphyseal plates right there. If that happens too quickly, that can result in some pretty interesting things. Just for fun little trivia here, sometimes you'll see what's called Osgood-Schlatter's disease, which is actually a condition where the epiphyseal plates grew a little too quickly, and what ended up happening is they actually ended up with an excess of bone tissue here on the shin, and so their patellar tendon will unfortunately rub against that knob that's really not supposed to be there. Ooh, man, there's a really big one. And what'll end up that leads to like friction, and so it can be really hard for like people with Osgood-Schlatter's disease to like kneel on certain material. Like, you know, kneeling positions tend to be really painful. They tend to have really tight quadriceps, which leads to weak quadriceps. Tends to be like some problems there. But for the most part, it's not that unhealthy. I mean, you look at like, God, you look at like most people in the NBA, I'll bet. I wonder what, yeah, you know what? I'm sorry to do this. I'm going to sidetrack just temporarily. What percentage of NBA players have Osgood-Schlatter's? I wonder how many. So this is definitely not the NBA, but from 1 overall, number 257 male. Yeah, 8.9%. That's a pretty high number. I mean, this is a pretty rare disease. To have 9% of folks, that's definitely higher than, let's see, what percentage of people have Osgood-Schlatter's? 8% if you're a basketball player. What? 20%? No way. No way is it higher than in basketball populations. This is what happens when you try to look up information quickly. It ruins your data. I would be very surprised. I mean, I would assume it is way more common amongst basketball players. It happens by growing too quickly, basically. So that's what a growth channel is. Certainly won't forget that now. It does usually happen in big spurts. I'm sure everybody in here remembers like growing pains, right? And that is kind of something that happens where it's like kind of achy, you know? So recommendations for youths. Proper height and weight in young athletes is obviously achieved by consuming the appropriate number of calories. So there is certainly going to be a focus. So nutritional strategies is definitely one of the biggest one is going to be consume adequate calories that will result in bodily growth, right, without being like excessive. Trainers and parents play a super critical role in the nutrition of like youths, right? This is huge, right? A trainer can have a really big influence on like what a youth is consuming, as well as like the parents. I mean, they're the number one. Those are the two areas that are, you know, where people are actually like kind of getting their advice from. So that's going to be really big. One of the best ways to ensure that like overeating doesn't happen is to establish a regular meal schedule. And that often includes snacks throughout the day. We're going to see a silly slide here coming up. Yep. So what are some healthy snack options? And then right at the top, first one on a PowerPoint, literally designed to talk about good nutrition, Pudding cups. What? I mean, here's the thing. A lot of times they are fortifying the crap out of pudding cups. Pudding cups are almost like they're almost like little protein shakes. Like they don't have high protein in them, but they will often have like lots of calcium and iron and all this other stuff added to them because we know that they're things that kids like. But typically, like dried fruits and things like that, graham crackers can actually be a really good source of calories because honestly, one of the most important things for a youth is really just calories, right? Ensuring that they have enough energy. Fig bars, dry cereal, string cheese, cheeses, milk, yogurt. Lots of dairy are really recommended for kids, especially here, but that makes a lot of sense considering that we are developing bone tissue, right? So I'm not necessarily against high calcium intake. If you want to get it from milk, you can. I love milk. I have to like play devil's advocate constantly because like, don't get me wrong, I am a milk addict. But that is because I grew up in America where we freaking love it. So I'm not saying milk is healthy. I'm not necessarily saying it's unhealthy, but I will say it is high in sugar, and that cannot be refuted. And now you can draw your own conclusions. So fluid intake is also huge. This is absolutely important. I was one of these kids who just never wanted to stop to drink water. My parents, I was so notorious for this because I'm like a sweater now. And for the most part, kids don't really sweat all that much. But even as a kid, I was a sweaty little child. And so like my parents would take me to like, you know, Chuck E. Cheese's or whatever. And like I liked playing at the video games and stuff, but my favorite thing at Chuck E. Cheese's was just like the ball pit and then like all the tubes and stuff. And my parents would watch me like sprint around and I would like and just like run. And eventually they would just watch me like every lap get a little redder and a little redder and a little redder until I looked like I was gonna explode and I was a sweaty mess. And eventually my mom would just like grab me and I'd be like like, and she's like, you have to. And I remember like literally I was the only kid at like birthday that constantly got pulled aside at birthday parties and stuff because like I was told I had to drink water. Like my parents would be like, stop, and they would make me like cool down and then like let me run off again. That is something to consider. I'm sure there are more kids, you know, who are just like that. So children produce way more heat and they sweat way less, which means that they are very, very bad at regulating their temperatures. And this is definitely something we want to be aware of. So children are due to being at a higher risk of dehydration, it is important to ensure that youths have regular access to fluids. Get them some water, right? Youths struggle with temperature control, and water can enhance this, right? So they are terrible at temperature control, but luckily water can kind of help them be a little better at it. So make sure that they are providing sports bottles, encourage hydration. My favorite thing whenever I'm training, I mean, honestly, you guys have probably heard me say this, like if you've ever, anybody who's ever actually like worked with me in person knows that I'll say this to everybody. I like to use the phrase mandatory water break. And so we'll take like a break in the gym and I'll see people like go to their phones and I'm like, that's not a bottle of water. This is a water break, not a phone break. So offer breaks frequently, monitor their fluid intake. And if you can, like, you know, provide flavored beverages. That's a great way to ensure that kids are going to get super excited about, you know, actually drinking. Micronutrients, also really important. We have some strategies here. Particularly, we're going to put some special emphasis onto calcium, right? Calcium intake gets a special emphasis due to bodily growth. So we're going to focus on getting RDA for males and females between 9 to 18 is 1,300 milligrams per day. So we're getting plenty of that. That's going to be super important there. We also want to make sure that females in particular are getting plenty of iron. That's going to be really important. So our RDA for girls and boys, 9 to 13, is going to be 8 milligrams per day. That's going to go up a little bit for post-pubescent girl clients. So we do need to be aware of that. But iron intake is another one. So iron, RDA for iron is 8 milligrams per day. And we do want to make sure that like we are not over exceeding these things, because taking too much calcium can create things like bone spurs. Taking too much iron can result in like problems in our in the blood, right? So that's important things to be aware of. Now, on the opposite side of things, we also have our master athletes, aka your seniors. I love it. It's such a respectful, better term. But master athletes, which are going to be older adults who are consistently active between the ages of 40 to 50 years old. So I love this because like we all know some master athlete. Like we've all played like pickup basketball with that dude who's like 45, 50 years old, who's out there and just like knocking you over because he plays old school and he plays kind of dirty. He's like hucking elbows, but he's so old you don't want to say anything. That's kind of your classic like master athlete there. And so we do have some like recommendations here, right? We have some nutritional changes. And so we're still going to focus on like normal caloric intake here, but there are some like chronic diseases that are associated with getting older that we need to be aware of. So we're going to pay special attention to total caloric intake, chromium, and iron intake, as well as calcium, vitamin D, and magnesium, right? So that is actually, these are all things that we are definitely going to pay very close attention to. The LA Fitness Pros, yeah, absolutely, man. Those, dude, when I used to work at LA Fitness, and like I hated going into the basketball court because like, you know, those guys would constantly bring like weightlifting benches into the basketball court so that they had a place to sit, and I was always the one who had to go in there and be like, give me my benches back. Like, you can't have those. I need those for people to do chest presses. Like, and then like I'd get in this argument with like these olders, like, we're paying members. I was like, I don't, eventually like I just got so, I was like, I don't care. And I stopped listening. I would just go in there and take them without asking. And it was always the same crew of like old cronies. So those are all things to pay attention to. So for seniors, calories, iron, calcium, vitamin D, and then chromium and magnesium are also two really important. And we know that like excessive levels of fat mass can result in a detriment to athletic performance, as well as like an increase in heart disease and everything else. So our carbohydrate for master athletes is actually going to go a little bit up, at least in terms of average. So carbohydrate intake, rather than 45 to 65, is going to be 50 to 65%, so still nothing too crazy. Protein is going to be much higher as well. That's going to be 1 to 1.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. So we see an increase in protein. We see an increase of carbohydrates, and then we're going to see a moderate level of fat. So moderate fat levels from 20 to 35%. Chromium, 30 micrograms after age 50, right? Iron, 8 milligrams per day. So we're going back up again. That's going to be pretty similar to like youths. Actually, we're actually going to see, there's actually a lot of similarities between like seniors and youths in terms of their nutrition. You'll notice we see like 1,200 milligrams a day for women, which is just barely below what we saw earlier. So this is going to be for female athletes. So for female senior athletes, we want 1,200 milligrams per day of calcium. We will also, in males over age 70, we're going to want to also have 1,200 milligrams per day. Vitamin D consumption of 800 IU per day, and magnesium of 320 to 420 milligrams per day for women and men respectively. Okay, so there's a lot of we're focusing a lot on, you know, specific nutrients here. Like until now, a lot of our general recommendations have kind of gone a long ways. But with our senior clients, we're actually saying like, hey, we need to make sure we're getting plenty of these specific vitamins in. We want to do that through whole foods, but this is often where like the use of a multivitamin does come in very handy. I think for two reasons. Number one, it's convenient, which is great. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. But number two, I mean, when we get older, we tend to get stubborn. And so like making dietary changes when you're that far along, I mean, like it's like my grandma who, you know, is wearing a mask when she goes out to certain places only for the sake of making others comfortable. But like the other day, she was like talking about how she went for a walk around the park and like didn't. I was like, Grandma, you're exactly the type of person that I want wearing a mask. And she's like, look, I've been on this earth for X number of years. And like, if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna go out my way. And I'm like, oh, there's no way I'm gonna ever convince my grandma otherwise. So supplements, they're handy, right? Boom, and you're done. It's easy. Moving on. Rather than like, hey, you can't have that pizza anymore. Dietary modifications for chronic diseases we are going to see. Here are a lot of our general. Honestly, this is actually one of my favorite master lists here. So if your client has like atherosclerosis or hypertension, right? Decrease total fat and especially saturated fat and cholesterol, increase complex carbs that have more fiber and antioxidants in them, and try to get plenty of vitamin E. Hypertension, increase your calcium, potassium, protein, magnesium, and fiber. All of these are modifications that can be really great. With diabetes, decrease your overall total calories, decrease your sugar, increase your fiber. You know, all of those are really, really good strategies there. Fix that. All right, last one we've got. We're going to take a look at vegetarian diets. So if you have a client who is a vegetarian, so we are looking at vegetarians here, by the way, not vegans, because there is a difference. A vegetarian is somebody who does not consume meat. A vegan is somebody who does not consume animal products. There is a difference there, right? So when we look at a vegetarian like pyramid, right, our proteins are not coming from animal sources. Instead, we're getting them from things like legumes and beans. Then we can see like, you know, we want to focus primarily on fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and bean sources. Daily, we want to make sure we're getting plenty of like plant oils, maybe things like egg whites, maybe some dairy, and nuts and seeds. These are all really good sources of fat. And then every now and then we're allowing, you know, sweets and things like that. And ideally, we want to consume 6 glasses of water a day, and we can have alcohol, but very much in moderation. So this is very much kind of looking at your classic like food pyramid here. There are a difference between like vegetarian diets. So if we're looking at like vegetarian diets, here's how you can kind of decipher what those means. So you have like a vegan diet, which is, whoops, no animal products whatsoever, right? So that is, a vegan is somebody who does not eat anything. Now, sometimes you're going to see the term like ovo-vegetarian, which is a vegetarian who does eat eggs. You've got lacto-vegetarians, which are a vegetarian who does consume milk. You have lacto-ovo vegetarians. Starting to see a pattern here. Lacto-ovo vegetarian, a vegetarian who consumes eggs and milk. Then you have a pescatarian, which is a pescatarian, I'm sorry, a vegetarian who does consume fish. All right, there we go. And then you get your classic, like, honestly, what you call a vegetarian. And a vegetarian in general is somebody who consumes dairy, eggs, poultry, and fish. So the way the rules work, guys, whatever you say at the beginning is what they do consume. So a lacto-vegetarian does consume milk, but they still exclude all the other stuff. Complementary proteins are going to be a huge part of so nutrition strategies for vegetarians. One of the most important ones is there is going to be a focus on complementary proteins, right? And what a complementary protein is that is a protein where you are consuming two incomplete proteins in order to make a complete protein, right? The consumption of two incomplete proteins in order to create a complete protein, right? And remember our term from earlier, right? A complete protein is contains all essential amino acids, right? So a good example includes beans plus rice at the same time. That's a good example of a complementary protein. A grain plus a bean, that's a really good example. Or like nuts plus grains. Those are all really good examples of how to create complementary proteins. On vegetarian diets, you are also going to want to focus primarily, you're going to make sure that we're getting plenty of legumes, nuts, and fortified soy products. These are going to be a great way to provide protein, iron, zinc, calcium, all kinds of different things. So focused on legumes, nuts, fortified soy products in order to ensure appropriate, we'll say adequate protein intake. Protein powders come in really handy. The focus should be on whole foods, right? The focus should be on whole foods. And that's it. That's vegetarians in a nutshell. So diabetes, obviously a metabolic disorder that affects how your body's blood glucose levels respond. Pregnancy is going to have its unique demands focused on an increased energy intake as well as like high levels of protein and certain types of vitamins. Youths are going to be highly at risk for dehydration. Iron and calcium are going to be a really big part of their diet as well. Master athletes need to consider all normal nutritional strategies with some extra ones as well. Higher protein intake, lower fat content, higher carbohydrate intake, and a big focus on micronutrients. And depending on the type of vegetarian diet that you're on, that could, if you're a full vegan, you're probably going to want to focus a lot on learning your complete proteins. Whereas like if you're a pescatarian, at least, by consuming fish, you're ensuring that you're getting complete proteins pretty easily throughout your diet. And that's that, guys. It's a relatively quick one tonight, but that is all I got for you. Do you guys have any questions? We lost Nancy.
I do, Brad. So I've heard of somebody who might be hypoglycemic.
Okay.
And they might be pre-diabetic. So how does that work if their levels are low?
So their blood sugar levels are low, but they're pre-diabetic?
Yes.
They probably have some other type of hormonal deficiency, which is resulting in, even though there are like low glucose levels, they might have like an excessively high protein diet. chances are there's some other thing happening on there, or they have really sensitive glucose receptors. You have these two receptors called GLUT1 and GLUT4, and they kind of regulate how well your body like utilizes insulin. So if those are just like, if they just have bum receptors, like if there's just something locked in their DNA making that happen, that's probably like what's occurring. That's a unique case. I almost find that hard to believe actually, just because that's fairly unique. But it's
Trust me, when
nothing
I heard
so
it, I
possible.
was like, how does that work? Like I was
Yeah.
trying to search up everything and it wasn't making sense to me.
Yeah, it would definitely be like, it's usually like a receptor problem, you know.
Yeah.
Everybody has like everybody has like unique receptors, you know. Like for instance, like Mo and I were having an interesting conversation about like hormones today and how, you know, you might be creating enough testosterone, but maybe that testosterone's all getting converted into like androgens, you know, which is all the stuff that like makes your hair fall out and gives you like body hair, but does not help you like develop muscle at all, or you know, help you regulate your sleep or mood or other hormones. So it's like, what do you mean? I have plenty of testosterone, but it's not doing anything for me? And it's like, yeah, unfortunately, you know, like you just got bum receptors, you know, like the receptors that would pick your testosterone up to anabolically build muscle, they just don't. You know? So that's kind of what I would expect is the case with your friend, is that like, you know, they're not binding to sugar the way they should be. Um, there's definitely like anomalies out there. But yeah, any other questions? That was a good one. Nope.
Nope.
All right. Well, heck, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and end tonight's call. I'll get this up on Canvas, and I'll see all y'all tomorrow for our final exam.
All right. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. See you guys.